So in the last video, I talked about discovering the quality of space and its infinite nature, and in the process of building mechanisms to remind oneself as to what role infinite space plays for the self in an existential sense. The sense is, how do we relate to ourselves and how do we relate to the world? And that the self is a composite of two different infinities. That means an active and a passive infinity. Being actually one and the same, it's just that the infinity can be active and it can be passive. And that space has a passive quality of non-being, and that is the required element of passivity in order to experience sensation, in the sense that space is the sensorium of the self. So having discovered, or in discovering that personal space, that intimate existential notion and experience of the self, the spatial quality of the self in an absolute sense, and it creating a sense of eternal patience when it becomes the center and the throne upon which the self can reside and stay in, while the world is moving, the finite objects in the world are being experienced and not interacted with. There is a passive observation in a sentient way. And from this point of view, or from this position, it is possible at any moment given in time, for various reasons, to want to act on, or to decide to act on the finite world, or the world of finite objects. And that act is done through a volitional agency, or the volitional spirit. It is done through a causation of itself, because that causation also comes from the infinite. But just as the infinite is the sensorium of the self, the infinite is also the power of causation. It is the power which creates differentiation when it is active, when it decides to be active. And that causation, when it interacts with just the self, simply creates a direction. So, an infinite space, in an absolute sense, if it were to act on itself, it would create an infinitely small point within itself, and it says, I am. And that I am is just an infinitely small point within an infinitely large absolute space. But in a world of complex objects, in a world of a multitude of finite objects, and in a human body, the activity, the agency on this finite world is more than just I am, but it is a relationship with those objects, a complex relationship, which can be simplified by simply interacting with them like a child, saying, well, if I push or pull, or if I play with these objects, then waiting for, or playing in order to have interesting pleasures occur, because they do. But there is another possibility of creating a causality, an interference, or a relationship with another objects, and that is to test one's own volition, one's own agency, one's own causality. For reasons that are beyond the current understanding of the structure of the world. There are different types of intensities of volitions at different moments in time. And as to why volition or agency of the self is stronger at some moments than it is at others is rather a very complex issue. But just taking it as a given that it is sometimes stronger than others and that it can be strengthened, notably by the objects of the soul. The objects of the soul serving as a conduit. That would be one example, but without going into details about that, when the causality of the self, when there's agency towards a directed point, it creates an interference pattern on the object that it is focusing on. So let's say we take a simple object, and that object is being focused upon. The structure and momentum that object has within itself is interfered with, just as with the notion, the general notion that an object that is observed is influenced, not necessarily in the sense that the quantum physics have tended to portray it, but that the general principle of, by observing an object actively and not passively. If it is done passively, then it is not being interfered with. But if it is done actively, then that object is interfered with. And the more intense the focus is on that object, the more interference there is on that object. Now, what interference depends on the type of focus that is, of course, done with the object. But insofar as we talk about intensity, then that intensity does have an influence by principle on an object. Now, usually we have this principle in everyday experience, in a sense. If we take the example of a river flow, where the water is flowing down a mountain or a hill, if we wanted to create an interference, all we would have to do is decide and use our own volition through our bodies to carry a large rock and place it on anywhere inside the river, and that interference will then be very visible. And so the principle of interference is an everyday occurrence and is very readily available, and it's nothing new in that sense. But once the volition of the self is discovered, and that its nature is a causality in itself, and that it comes from the infinite absolute, then at its variant intensities, it can cause interference. Now, that interference can be towards something good or bad. It can be towards something constructive or destructive. Really, it is at the discretion of the person acting. And so when that interference is discovered, it is an enlightening moment. It is a moment of discovering one's power and one's humility. One's power in the sense that being able to influence the world by merely acting from this volitional point, from this sentient point of the self, that the self has an influence on it, then that is extremely empowering, because it feels like one is born now as a magician of sorts, or a wizard or a sorcerer, that is akin to, wanting now to having fantasies of going to Hogwarts or something of that nature. But it is also humiliating, because as to having all these fantasies of grandeur, notice that the amount of change or the amount of interference that one can cause at the moment of its first realization is very dismaying. It's like being given a magician's wand and only being able to fizzle with it. Little sparks, barely noticeable sparks, and that its potential is extreme. But in actuality, when using it and playing with it at first, it is somewhat disheartening and disillusioning and disenchanting. So it's a double-edged discovery that we're discovering a new currency of power, but we have very little of it. In a sense that it's like finding a gold piece hoarded a long time ago into a cave, and that cave is meant to hoard those gold pieces, and only to discover that there is actually only one gold piece there, and that the rest is dispersed in other mountains, so to speak. And this goes a little bit into the objects of the souls that are dispersed around in the world. And so just like with the flow of the river, if the intention was to redirect the flow, say at a 45-degree angle in one direction, that would be a lot of work. You would need more than just one large rock. You would probably need, depending on how far and how densely the rocks would have to be put together, create a dam or a wall in order to direct the flow of the river in that 45-degree angle in a different direction until you find another drop-off point. And that drop-off point is circumstantial, not relative to you, but relative to the river that you are standing in front of. And so that would be a lot of work for maybe something that is either, well, if it is important to you, then it is rewarding, of course. But if it's just a trial, if it is just a test of one's ability, then that might be a lot of work without really knowing how far one has to go. Unless you know where the drop-off point is, but as a beginner, usually you don't. But it is possible. And so too, the interference that one does while focusing on an object, or focusing on a point even, but let's take an object, is a relationship with that particular object. That particular object has its own density, it has its own structure, and it has its own momentum. And causing an interference, though it might be very small, and by small I mean truly minuscule, unless there is an intense moment happening for various reasons that are beyond usually the general consciousness. Though the interference may be very small, with time, a field of probability of chaos, right? Just as with the flow of the river that hits the first rock, there is a fog of mist that is bundling around with the interaction with the large rock. And so too, the normal linear deterministic causality that the object has innate within itself, that it has structured into, has its directions that it is repeating over and over and over. And so by causing an interference, or by focusing on the object in a specific way, so too it's causing a fog of chaos, and that fog of chaos is the beginning of probabilities. Now the energy is not going in its repetitive motion, but it is open to new possible directions. And so that chaos, that distortion, that interference, that confusion is the first step. And then from that first step, then there's a direction. What type of change one wants. And that second step is to giving it direction. And so discovering one's own power is very enlightening in the sense that it's giving fantasies of a myriad of directions. But once a direction is chosen, for the mere sense of choosing one, in order to test oneself, in order to discover one's identity, so by that interacting with not only with the self but with the world, we discover our potentiality of our relationship with the world. Because if we were only to relate to ourselves, then we just have infinity. We have sentience and we have causality. But just with the self, there is no resistance. There is just whatever you want there to be. But the world has a myriad of selves. It has a world that has been created, a world that has created also itself. And being in that world is not just about the self, it is about the many selves, and about the world that that is constructed between the selves, that is shared by the selves. And so in creating a relationship with objects in an active way, right? Just as, let's say, a sculptor would turn a rock into a sculpture. He has created, and it starts with a very humble experience or a powerful experience that he can cause change in a rock, and that the direction that he chooses to go, or the directions that he chooses to go, then will reveal as to what the statue will become through his choices and his ability to focus. So too, that magic of focus in its variant agencies, intensities, will create a differentiation in the world, because that's what it is by nature. And that is an incredible power, and it is also an incredible humility. And when different directions are chosen and tested, a whole new world of possibilities opens up, and a new depth to the world, a new quality of a relationship that is more holistic and awakens part of the self that had already existed, and awaken parts of the soul.